So my name is Andrew Barden. I'm a managing editor at Bloomberg. I run Europe, Middle East, and Africa. I am also a resident of Dubai. And joining me today on the panel, we have a selection of government officials and international organizations, the private sector, a great cross-section. So I can't actually see the names here, so I'm going to call you up as you're on my piece of paper here. Minister Imad Fakouri is the Jordanian Minister for Planning and International Cooperation. Did I call you? I did call you right. Okay, good. Dr. Mahmoud Mohieldin, Senior Vice President at the World Bank for the 2030 Development Agenda. Dr. Claire Melamed, Executive Director at the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. The award-winning Minister Sri Indrawati, the Indonesian Finance Minister. Liu Zhenmin, United Nations Under-Secretary General for Economic and Social Affairs. Ashim Steiner, Administrator of the UN Development Program. And Sunny Verghese, Group CEO of Olam International, and especially relevant for this panel, Chair of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So thank you very much for joining me. So the title of this panel is Innovation Partnerships to Support the Implementation of SDGs. I was having dinner last night with my family, and I told the kids that I was going to do this, not thinking that they would be in the slightest. Well, two of them definitely weren't interested, but the oldest one, when I said it was about SDGs, and it was slightly complicated, said, "Oh, Daddy, I know all about the SDGs," and proceeded to rattle off at least 10 or 12 of them. And I thought that was precisely the type of real partnerships that are required to get these off the ground. And he's only 11 years old, so well done to the Dubai educational boards for pushing that through. So we have 7 panels. We have 50 minutes, which is about 7 minutes per person if we want to treat everybody equally. And so I've prepared a few questions here, and the panelists know that they can feel free to interject and add on if anybody would like. The first question that I had here, if I could, Minister Fakouri, having been based in the Middle East now for 7 years, I've followed very closely the situation in Jordan, in Syria. You're facing tremendous strains from refugees. One of the conclusions from yesterday's talks was funding gaps remain key challenge in meeting SDGs. And so I thought perhaps I could start by asking you a question here that's relevant to the region in terms of partnerships. Is how evenly burdened should the SDGs be shared? You've described the situation that your country's facing as a slow motion tsunami that's impacting the sustainable development path.
Thank you very much, Andrew. It's a great pleasure to be here in Dubai at the Global Government Summit. A great honor to be with all of you today. Obviously, we're looking in this session at the specifics of innovative partnerships to support implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. And the case of Jordan and your question looks at it from the point of view of the disruption that has happened because we're neighboring probably one of the worst conflicts we've seen, and the ensuing displacement and refugee crisis has been probably the worst the world has seen since World War II. So let me put it in context. The first decade of the 21st century, Jordan was growing at about 7% real economic growth. We've averaged that rate. we moved and became an upper middle income country. And then in 2011, the so-called Arab Spring broke out, and specifically the Syria conflict, which had also spread into West Iraq and so on, was devastating. This is, we're about to start now the 8th year. So on an annual level, the direct costs of hosting the refugees was about $1.5 billion annually. That's about 16% of our budget revenues. And you look at it, 1 in 5 Jordanians today as a walking is a Syrian. So it's 1.3 million Syrians, only half are registered refugees. This is thinking of, the EU having to receive 100 million to get to that proportion of their population. Think about that. And they're on average 15 to 20 times higher in per capita income. So you understand. So for us, you cannot ignore that in 2011 and 12, I mentioned this, we had a perfect storm. No one could have designed a more disruptive set of factors to impact our development. The refugee impact, which was very costly, the tremendous rise in oil and commodity prices, the disruption of our gas supplies from Egypt, and all the increased security, military costs on the borders and all of that. And we were in the midst of actually implementing our 10-year development plan called the National Agenda from 2005 to 2015. And that was quite disruptive. The way we reacted, we had to quickly, work on maintaining macroeconomic and fiscal stability, because the burden of all of these things that were also, we had a lot of subsidies built historically into our electricity, the oil products, bread, and so on, which became very costly fiscally at that time. So we launched a national fiscal reform program in cooperation with the IMF, both a standby arrangement followed by, we're in the midst of it, an extended fund facility, what's called an EFF. We've done relatively well in removed all the subsidies and so on many sectors, and removed it on bread, removed it on electricity, removed it on oil products. It's been very hard, obviously, on the population, but we created the right partnerships globally to respond also to the Syria crisis. We pioneered launching a resilience plan that has become now the UN model in terms of pushing the international community to look at host countries who are hosting refugees and neighboring crises, that this is a global public good and there has to be a fair burden sharing. And the international community has to factor in the carrying capacity of a country that absorbs a lot of refugees in designing the solidarity, the fair burden sharing, and so on. So in terms of our national roadmap for the SDGs, unfortunately, because of the increase in population, which was about 14%, and the very equivalent almost of a landlocking and economic siege that we've experienced for 6 years of no fault of our own, we dropped from an upper middle income country back to a low middle income country. And so we started to experience a regression in our hard-earned development gains. So that gave us a chance, after restoring the fiscal stability, to look at very quickly launching a new socioeconomic roadmap building on the MDGs and integrating the SDGs into it. So we launched in 2015 the Jordan 2025 as our roadmap. We worked then on creating partnerships at the national level to oversee our SDG roadmap. So we have a higher committee that is chaired by me as Minister of Planning International Community that has membership of all concerned government agencies, civil society, private sector organizations, parliament, municipalities, and so on. So we oversee our roadmap and plan to implement the SDGs. We've integrated into our national planning framework the SDGs, so we mainstream them, so we localize them. And in terms of implementation, our biggest challenge is going to be, obviously, the financing gap. So we worked with the UN in an experiment where all the UN agencies are working with us through what is called the delivery as one. So they integrate their work to help the government in areas where we might need capacity building or technical assistance. So we have effectiveness in terms of the ability to move along the path. And on the financing side, as we all had agreed internationally through the global partnerships we've done in Addis Ababa, delivering the SDGs is going to require a huge change in the way we look at public finances and we deliver. So issues of leveraging ODA, using blended finance, and doing a lot of the capital investments and expenditure that governments need to do, especially when you have very little fiscal space left in view of either the burdens or either structural and fiscal reform programs, which many countries in our part of the world are experiencing, given the instability and the things we've done here. So that kind of forces us to look at public-private partnerships and blended finance to rechannel sufficient resources to deliver on the 17 SDGs, and hopefully through our successive development plans, find the right amount of resources. I'm pleased to say that in the past 10 years, the economy of Jordan, which is about $40 billion today, has done close to $10 billion of PPP in infrastructure. So we have a very good track record of bringing in private sector participation in developing infrastructure, at the hard type of infrastructure. And now we're moving in pulling the private sector to deliver the social infrastructure, which is very important in terms of education, healthcare, and all of that, to do all of that. This is really the story of Jordan. It's a story of resilience and turning challenges into opportunities. It's a story of great hospitality to our own citizens who have put up with a lot of pressure and have really done the right thing as a nation, as a country, by welcoming waves of refugees. The Syrian one is just the last one of many waves of registered. Jordan has about 3.5 million refugees, about 2.9 who are registered historically, who are in the country, and about close to 700,000 who are not registered with the UN. So if you take it a proportion to the population, that makes us the largest host of refugees, registered refugees in the world as a country. So this is a story of trying to resume your sustainable development roadmap and math, whilst at the same time having the reality, given your geopolitical location of no fault of your own as a country, to absorb tremendous disruptions that really crowd out your financing, your fiscal space, and force you to some extent to do much more reforms than you would have had to do under normal circumstances, but overburdening our citizens, but still continuing to do the right thing going forward.
Let me bring in Mr. Zhenmin, because he at least 3 times mentioned the UN there in terms of a partnership for what was clearly from the Jordanian perspective a black swan event that has overwhelmed them. What is your role in that partnership when countries are on one side trying to meet these SDGs, but then at the same time being overwhelmed? And if I could, as part of that question, as you know, these reviews are voluntary and state-led. In 2016, you had 22 countries conduct voluntary national reviews. In 2017, it was 43 countries that you've based this report on. How are we looking for 2018? And as you support countries like Jordan, how do you perhaps gently apply pressure on countries that haven't faced a black swan event and really could be included in this?
The Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN. It's a department to serve as a secretariat for the implementation of SDGs. I shall share 3 points with the colleagues. First, what's the status of implementation? You know that over the past 2 years, everywhere you go, there's a very lively discussion about SDGs. But until now, nobody knows what's the real situation of countries in the implementation. When the leaders adopted 2030 agenda, it's an agenda for all member states. It's a universal global agenda. Then at the same time, it's a so-called voluntary national review system has been established that are encouraging all member states to present national reviews. So under the high-level political forum that are being managed by ECOSOC and General Assembly to have this review. Over the past 2 years, you are rightly saying, 65 countries have presented reviews. For 2018, in the coming July, we should have 48 countries to present a review. On the basis of this review, on the preliminary findings, we have found that all countries, they have incorporated the SDG into the national action plans. But there are also tremendous challenges and problems in the implementation, especially in developing countries. That's why I think we are promoting and encouraging that we need for the rest of around 80 countries to have the reports within the next 2 years. So then by 2020, we could complete first round of review of all countries. We need to know the overall picture, global picture of the implementation of 2030 agenda. I think that's becoming very challenging. Because this is voluntary, we cannot impose all countries to have the reports, but we are encouraging for the benefit of a global agenda that all countries could have their reports in the next 2 years. Second point I want to say that over the past 2 years, I think there have been quite good progress in setting up partnerships. Especially, we're talking about so-called thematic partnerships. Within the UN system, we have a number of partnerships, like we have a Development Cooperation Forum, we have Financing for Development Forum, we have Multi-Stakeholder Science, Technology, and Innovation Forum, and we have a SDG Business Forum. So a number of forums have been set up. I know that different regions, they also set up different partnerships. But now I want to say that we should not be confined ourselves to these forums. We should need to develop more innovative partnerships. I think that now, you see, everywhere you go, people are more interested in setting up the thematic forums. Now we're talking about how new technology will facilitate implementation of SDGs. But in the experience of the United Nations, or from my department, we see it in the coming years, in the coming 13 years, we need to invest more energy, more effort in developing new partnerships. For example, how we could help small island developing countries in the implementation of their SDGs. How we could help least developed countries to implement the SDGs. So we need to have some special focus for those countries really needed. Because for OECD countries, they are still the distance of measurement, distance in their implementation. But definitely they have the capacity for implement. But those who need help, assistance, developing countries, especially the developing countries in special situations. That's why I think in the coming years, I also encourage and appeal to the international community, we need to develop really innovative partnerships to focusing on which area we could really devote. Not just talking about partnerships. That's why I think we are appealing to we should have some partnerships focusing on particular regions, particular countries, to see what really could help them. Because the overall principle for implementing 2030 agenda is to leave no one behind. Leave no one behind means that we should leave no country behind. We need to ensure 193 members of UN should be not left behind in the implementation of 2030 agenda. So that's why we need to have a country by country review to see what's their needs, what's their challenges, what's their problems, how we could help. For example, some countries came to me, said they need the capacity for even data collection. So how we could help them for data collection. We have data collection by UN, my department has statistics division, we have data collection. We issue a report, annual report on SDG indicators. OECD has also good data, but for some countries, we do not have their own official data. We need help them. That's why I think we need next step, and the next step, we need to develop more innovative partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could, I'll bring Minister Indrawati, who I think is all the way down on the end there. If you could talk to us a little bit about the national or implementation on a national level, how you're supporting that execution and making it possible. And we were talking earlier, you can have disruptions such as the one that Jordan is facing, which is geopolitical. There's also this other wave of disruption that's coming at us, which is AI and automation. So how do you implement this at the same time, prepare for this change, this coming change, which few times in history we've experienced?
Well, thank you very much for having me here. First of all, for Indonesia, it's a big country, 257 million people, and also at the same time learning from what we've already achieved or failed to achieve in the MDG before. We actually try to formulate this SDG within the context of the government, especially under the leadership of President Jokowi. He was elected based on a platform which is actually almost identical with the SDG. So for the government to actually putting within the government own program, which is almost identical whether you talk about poverty, inequality, hunger, you talk about job, you're talking about energy. These are all exactly the area that the government really focusing on. So first, the government is not having a difficulty in adopting this SDG. The second one, learning from the MDG, the one which is very important for us to fail at that time is actually the participation, or in this case, partnership. We have a good partnership with the IFIs, for example, the World Bank, ADB, AIIB, Islamic Development Bank, in which we use the both government-owned resources with the international financial institution, both on the money and knowledge and experience, in order for us to be able to address the issue, especially on a structural one, like poverty, inequality, education reform, health reform. This is the area that we are taking advantage of the international experience and put it within the context of Indonesia. Now, when we are now in the third years of the government, the technological change is actually becoming more and more a headline, especially in Indonesia. When we, in this case, one headline saying that a certain store has been closed, and they're saying that they cannot compete with the online digital economy. That creates more an anxiety. At the same time, also creating an opportunity. Indonesia has one company which is owned and invented by our own entrepreneur, that is Gojek. It's actually creating connection between the demand and supply using the apps in a very efficient way. It created job. It's much more efficient using this IT and algorithm in order to create more demand supply of Jakarta or Indonesia, big city, which is quite demanding. With the transport system like Uber type, but using motorcycle. So you connect 500,000 driver, which is in the past, they are becoming informal, now becoming formal, and more than 100,000 merchant, small, medium enterprises. People of Indonesia now can actually just asking for what is food or services, which is actually can get. So we see technology as a solution, but at the same time, there is a growing anxiety because Indonesia also transforming the economy from the primary sector agriculture based to become manufacturing, which is rely on labor intensive manufacturing. Now when everybody, every day we are watching that the technology is going to destroy this kind of labor intensive job, that creates another strategy that the government need to respond. Are we going to adopt the same strategy of creating job through this manufacturing low-skilled labor, or we are going to change? And you are not talking about 1 million, 5 million people. Indonesia is 257, more than 100 million labor force. So it's a young population who demand a better future. So for Indonesia government, SDG is real an opportunity, but also a challenge. How we are going to respond that? I think the government is trying to do what is actually fundamentally need to be done by the government. We invest in human capital. We allocate 20% of our budget for education, 5% for health. We are adopting universal health coverage. We are attacking the stunting and the food hunger in this case. But at the same time, we also rely more and more technology in monitoring. In the past, feedback takes longer. Now, with government technology, Minister of Finance, is actually using Instagram, Facebook. I'm telling the people that we allocate this much money for this district, for this kind of program. And we actually can get the feedback immediately in this case. In fact, actually, Indonesian people now following that I'm actually sitting here and saying that we are talking about SDG. So technology can provide the government this kind of feedback, which is never before. It takes longer bureaucracy, and sometimes the report is not always accurate. Now we can get it more instant. But it will create a challenge. How we are going to respond in a quick way? Because if you change education, for example, if the technology is going to require a different skill and knowledge, while the design of the curriculum, when you enter the education system, you are going to finish 20 years later from the primary school until you are in higher education. Then at the end of the year, you actually graduated in which the job is no longer available. And changing in the middle of all these things is going to require quite a lot of course, political economy. The reform of the curriculum, the teacher, even in Indonesia, government of Indonesia, president is asking, many of the global university want to enter Indonesia, but there is a resistance for this global university to be in Indonesia. So this kind of real reform change, which is going to face by many government. On the one hand, you try to be open, adopting all the new knowledge, technology, but at the same time, you have to be able to give the people an assurance and taking care, especially those who's vulnerable and left behind. So a combination between, on the one hand, you create competition to have innovation, productivity, but at the same time, you have to be able to make sure that for those who left behind, and in Indonesia, I mean 10.2% of those who live below poverty level, and those who's actually in the outer Java island because they have no connection on a infrastructure. Those kind of government resources need to be focused on those who left behind, while the policies should be open enough so that the market can solve some of the problem and can create innovation and productivity. Not always easy, I must say. The government of Indonesia, in this case, you talk about 33 provincial area, more than 540 district and municipality. When the president have the idea, not necessarily immediately can be translated. You're talking about local government, empowerment, have the similar vision, ability to execute. Then you are talking about capacity building. So a lot of agenda on our plate. If you talk about SDG, it's just identical. The question now for us, how we learn from the previous, like MDG, what we could learn from that, and how we can mobilize more partnership, private sector, market mechanism, philanthropists in this case. In fact, last week, 2 weeks ago, I was with Melinda Gates. We are announcing this initiative of Pathway for Prosperity. This is also addressing the issue of technology challenge for the developing and emerging country. So a lot of innovation that we need to strengthen so that the solution can be actually bring to any country problem, but at the same time, policymakers have to be able to always continue engage and listen. We connect with the private sector, we connect to the society, and then we are going to be able to respond accordingly. I think that is the area that we are going to do. Last thing, because you invite me as a finance minister, of course my job is to make sure that the fiscal policy is continuous sound, but again, responsive to this. SDG, meaning that you look at the 17 goals, you see which one require government direct resource, which one actually you can invite more private sector participation. So for example, like power sector, infrastructure, clean water. We are actually forcing the government and local government to actually able to invite public-private partnership. So they are not going to always asking me about more money for this infrastructure for the SDG. Because they are going to say, how come Minister of Finance talking about SDG, and when I ask for the clean water, you are not giving me money. So this kind of thing that you create more ability to solve this problem. And within the finance minister, we created the public-private partnership division. I have a state-owned enterprises who help local government as well as line ministry to be able to structure the investment in a public-private partnership scheme. This is all what we call it an idea of how you use the scarce resource for the most important one and creating space for the private sector to create solution using also technology. Thank you.
Thank you. At some point, Minister, I've been told that you need to sneak off the stage for a pre-existing commitment. So
Yeah.
she will not be leaving in protest. Well, it might be both. There may be a protest and a commitment,
No.
but I'm
No,
aware
no,
of that. Dr. Melamed, if I could bring you in. First of all, a personal question. In an interview, you once said that data can't trump politics. And I would like you to expand on that. You actually have the word partnership in your title, Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which I think is obviously relevant to this panel. How can data help governments hear from people what's most important for them, especially in countries that aren't necessarily democratic? And what about the partnership with the private sector as part of that solution?
Fascinating sitting here and listening to a number of my fellow panelists talking, talking about the role of new technologies and the role of new technologies such as AI and the potential now for rapid feedback and for all of the different ways that governments are able to exploit the new technologies. And of course, many of those technologies are built with data. Data is essentially the kind of raw material on which we are building artificial intelligence. Many of the real-time tools that we now deploy in policy making are built from data. And data always was a critical part of the infrastructure of politics, and it's becoming even more so the more that governments are able to exploit some of these new opportunities. So the role of my organization is to enable governments to exploit the new opportunities that are available in the world of data and technology by creating partnerships between governments, between the private sector, between non-governmental organizations. We work very closely also with United Nations agencies and your colleagues in the United Nations Statistical Division and others. And we're really about building the coalitions and the partnerships that are going to be the sort of vanguard of this new world that we're all so excited about, and are paving the way, creating the roadmap that can show us what data can do. So what can it do? Well, as you say, one of the really interesting ways that data is starting to enter into the political process is the kind of data which is not so much helping governments to run a more effective health service or understand where to put resources for education, although both of those things are absolutely critical, but data which can express the priorities of citizens and data which can actually help governments to understand their populations a little bit more. One of the things in my career that I'm probably most proud of is a big survey that I ran with Dr. Steiner's colleagues at UNDP, my colleague Paul Ladd, who's sitting in the audience, and others in the run-up to the development of the Sustainable Development Goals during the time that the goals were being negotiated. And we thought it would be a helpful exercise to ask the population of the world what they wanted in those goals. So we were able to elicit 10 million responses from across the world. That's more than 1 in every 1,000 people on this planet who responded to that survey and who were able to tell us, using quantitative data, what were their priorities for themselves and their families. And of course, many of those priorities, jobs, education, good healthcare, and honest and responsive government are now reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals. So that's, I think, one of the things that data can really help us to do at an international level and, of course, critically at a national level as governments are setting priorities, make it easier for governments to understand what their citizens want. But once we have that, then, of course, data is also a big part of government's ability to deliver those priorities. And there is, I think, quite rightly, a huge excitement over the ability, for example, of mobile phone data to be able to understand when populations move very rapidly, as in the situation of conflict or environmental disaster. It's much easier now to understand where people are, the routes through which people are traveling, because we can see either by the satellite photos that are being taken every minute around the globe or by tracking mobile phone signals, the way in which people are moving. And of course, that allows us to see, that allows us, governments, to predict, to understand, and to deliver much more effective policy that can react much more quickly. We always used to have data which was 3, 4, 5 years behind the present. We were always looking in the rearview mirror. But some of the new technologies and the new possibilities allow us to be seeing what is happening right now. And of course, as all of you on the panel who are involved in policy making will know, that is the absolutely critical piece of information that we need to be able to plot the course to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But the interesting thing, the challenge I think that faces for all of us is that in this new world of data and the opportunities that it presents, it's in a very real and practical sense actually impossible to achieve all of these things that we now know are possible without partnerships. The new technologies are not, by and large, within governments, but in other places, in the private sector, sometimes through the experiments generated by civil society and community groups. These new, huge, rapid volumes of data upon which new technologies are being built are not coming from inside governments, but from inside companies which are developing these new technologies. So to really harness the potential for the public good, for public policy, for the work of governments, for achieving the SDGs, it simply cannot be done without developing these very practical partnerships to find out what are the ways in which these different kinds of organizations can collaborate to achieve the SDGs. Now, that's very much the bread and butter of my organization. That's what we do all day. It's a difficult thing. We talk in venues like this very glibly about partnerships and the importance of partnerships, like it's a terribly easy thing to achieve. It really is not. It's a very hard thing to achieve the meaningful partnerships. In a sense, that's why we need the partnerships which are easy are going to happen anyway. It's those partnerships which are most difficult between organizations that have different interests, that have very different cultures and ways of working, which are the ones which are most worth having, because those are the ones where they're not going to happen anyway, where if all of us turn our attention to it, that's where the big gains are to be made here. So now finally, to come to the answer to your question. I mean, I think, I spend all day thinking about how to improve data, and I firmly believe that data is an absolutely essential part of the infrastructure for delivering the SDGs. But I also think it's incredibly important not to overstate the importance of data. Data is an ingredient in politics. It is not politics. It doesn't substitute for the political choices of governments. Data can't tell a government what is the correct tax policy or what is the correct level of investment in a health service or an education service. It can point out the consequences of taking different choices and the consequences for different groups of routes that governments might take. It's an absolutely essential, it is the map. Data provides the map on which policy is built, but I don't think it's data that can necessarily give the destination. And I think that's what I meant by saying I think we have to, in all the excitement about data, in which I am a very willing and enthusiastic participant, I also think it's important to recognize the role of data in the policy-making process. Thank you.
Thank you. Ashim, I'm going to turn to you next. in part because as we seek these partnerships and we seek to implement, or we're on this roadmap towards SDGs, you've also said it's important for us to realize that we're in economic determined times and measure ourselves by an indicator which is not perfect, which is GDP. And so you've spoken a little bit about how we must address ourselves to an economic paradigm or be imprisoned by it, which is a bit of a dose of reality. But can you expand on that?
Well, maybe the best test would be what would be the dinner conversation with your children when we discuss that, because I think what we often forget is that the SDGs are a product of a series of very disturbing and disruptive events. And, you know, we have just had another reminder quite how volatile our economies are on purely a sentiment that is there. We forget that 2008 wiped out trillions of dollars of wealth from the next generations. It indebted us, it disturbed us, it impoverished millions of people. So part of what happened post-2008, and that led governments, surprisingly, to actually agree on, first of all, an analysis, which is that economically determined policymaking in a singular GDP growth-oriented fashion simply would not work in a world of 7 billion people, and soon 8, 9, 10 billion people. That we had to, in a sense, and this is one of the tenets of the SDGs, I believe that's very critical, reconnect economy with people. That's what the SDGs do. It's one of the fundamental drivers that will make your children one day say, I'm glad you guys did something in 2015. Do you have to recite all 17 SDGs? No, that's the engine room. We don't need to know those things off by heart, but we need to understand what's central to it. And the second part, I think, which goes again to this economic determinism, that we lived through the latter part of the 20th century and then the 21st century in a kind of neoclassical world where government was bad, the markets were the only option, and quite frankly, anything that competition demanded in an increasingly interdependent world was used to dismantle social protection, national development priorities, essentially surrendering to this abstract notion of the market as if it was some law of physics that determined how economies work. So the second major part that also drove the SDGs, I believe, into challenging this economic paradigm was climate change and, quite frankly, what's happening to the ecological infrastructure on this planet. In this world in which we live, we also had to reconnect not only economy with people and society, we had to learn to decouple economy from environment. So here is the second major challenge to a paradigm that I think was defined by an era where, yes, it worked for some quite a lot, and for some for quite a long time. But actually, the bottom line at the beginning of the 21st century is an amazing one if you take it at meta and aggregated data, but it actually has also produced a world in which we are now heading for a 1.5 degree warming world, in which we have over 60 million refugees, in which we are facing social disruption, marginalization, extremism in a way that we have not seen since the 1940s. So finally, I think the other issue was to reinsert into economic policy making the freedom of choice. I think part of what we are living through right now is society is rebelling against this notion that they have somehow to accept choices being made by an abstract economic logic or theorem. And leaving no one behind, which is perhaps the most ethical, moral, or value-laden part of the SDGs, is no accident either. And I think it is quite extraordinary that in 2015 we should see rich countries, poor countries, small, large, small island developing states all converging on these 17 goals. Not because, as you just said, that they provide an answer, they provide us with a framework that emancipated people again in the economy, and also provided a different way of looking at the future where economy serves societal objectives. And let me end by just saying, Indrawati is gone now, it is a bizarre reality that in a period where inequality became ever more pronounced and therefore also ever more corrosive in our societies, we are living through a fiscal policy regime that is constantly reversing progressive taxation and actually promoting regressive taxation. And the United States is just the most egregious example of that right now. But this is a phenomenon we have watched for the better part of the last 20 years. You reduce income taxes for the high-wage earning um, players in the economy. You reduce corporate taxes and you increase VAT and general sales taxes and other taxes that we know are regressive. So yes, I think the SDGs are not, in a sense, a fundamental challenge to, they are a product of a recognition that this kind of economy is not going to work in the 21st century. And that is the remarkable moment why suddenly, you know, in 193 countries, people are beginning to use the SDGs. As Jean-Min said, we in the United Nations, I think, are sometimes surprised ourselves how actors in the private sector and civil society are beginning to work with it. And above all, I think we are now at the point where the SDGs will influence national planning frameworks, SDG budgeting, SDG-conform fiscal policies. And if I may just say, in our work in UNDP, every day around the world, what we see is that we are beginning to look at investments to solve one problem in terms of returns in multiple other goals. And that makes a completely different developmental choice and policy outcome choice possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Sunny, you represent a network of 200 CEOs responsible for 8.5 trillion in combined revenue and 19 million employees, which looks pretty good on a CV. But we've heard a lot of people here talk about the need to have this partnership with the private sector. So you have a cross-section of everybody on this panel here. What do you want to hear? What do you need?
Sure. Thank you. Clearly, I'm the odd man out on this panel. But it shows how far attitudes have changed, both in the public sector and the private sector, where now it's clear recognition on both sides that it's not about the triple P partnerships, public-private partnerships, but the 4P partnerships, public-private, plural society partnerships. I had lots of mixed emotions being in a panel of this kind, being the sole representative of the private sector. And it always reminds me when I have these mixed emotions about one of my professors at business school who used to end every class saying that he had mixed feelings about the class. He used to applaud us for some of the good things and incisive analysis that we had done, but mostly berate us for missing the obvious and not having the analytical rigor to understand the clear learning points in that case. And he had a vivid description of mixed emotions. And he used to describe his mixed emotions as this picture of his mother-in-law driving off the cliff in his brand new Ferrari. And I feel a little bit like that here today. So why should private sector bother about having sustainability at the heart of its business? I think the first thing is private sector has come to the realization that less than 5 to 10% of the long-term value that we can create in a business is reflected in our financial statements in terms of a profit and loss, in terms of a cash flow statements, or in terms of a balance sheet. And studies have been done on the S&P 500 companies, longitudinal studies over a long period of time, starting in 1975. And now it is very clear that less than 5 to 10% of the market value of the S&P 500 companies is accounted for by its financial capital and its economic capital. So if 95% of the long-term value of the company is driven by drivers that we are not today measuring and reporting because it's tough to measure and report them, then we're obviously missing a big thing. And if private sector's goal is to maximize long-term intrinsic value for the firm, how can you miss 95% or 90% of the drivers that will lead to that? So what is the value of the company's human capital in driving that long-term value? What is the value of a company's engagement scores or its inspired employee scores or its attrition scores or its capability building? How does it drive long-term value? What is the value of natural capital in the company's long-term value creation dynamics? What is the value of the social capital that the company creates in terms of its long-term value for the company? What's the value of its intangible capital, its intellectual capital? So one of the reasons why private sector is making this transition of becoming more sustainable and putting sustainability at the core of their business is this selfish realization that long-term value can only be driven by creating all the other forms of capital and value to all the other key stakeholders. The second reason why the private sector wants to embrace SDGs and sustainability is the notion we all now begin to recognize it's the right thing to do. It might sound very false in saying that, but it's the right thing to do. So in my sector, for example, if you look at the planetary boundaries, a group of earth scientists have worked for 60 years to determine the key ecological processes that drives man-made climate change impacts. And they have discovered and identified and crystallized what are the boundary conditions for these critical ecological processes, that if you breach those boundaries, you can result in having or driving cataclysmic or disruptive climate change impacts. 5 out of the 9 boundaries we are already exceeding and breaching. So one is climate change. You can't have more than 350 parts per million greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. We are at 415, 420 and rising. Second is biodiversity, and agriculture accounts for 25% of all the global greenhouse gas emissions. Secondly, biodiversity. We cannot allow more than 10 species for every million species going extinct each year. Right now, 1,000 species are going extinct each year for every million species that we have. So we have breached the boundary condition. The third boundary condition is biogeochemical loading, nitrogen and phosphate loading. China today uses 500 kilograms of fertilizer per hectare. The US uses 108 kilograms. And Germany, which is the largest intensive use of fertilizer country in Europe, 138 kilograms. If China is using 4.5 times the fertilizer that the leading agricultural economies are using, the consequence is 95% of Chinese surface water, river water, aquifers are polluted. You cannot continue to do that. So that's the third boundary condition. The fourth is land use change. The scientists have said we have to keep 75% of our biomes intact. We are at 63% and falling already. In water and ocean acidification, we are reaching the boundary levels. So there are only 3 out of these planetary boundaries that we are not exceeding. We account in the agricultural sector for 71% of all the freshwater withdrawals. So we don't have a future as a sector if we are not going to change. So we want to be sustainable because it's the right thing to do. Our industry depends on it as far as our future is concerned. The third is, today, the millennials do not want to work for a company like us just because they're going to come there and sell more cocoa or more coffee or any of the other products that we deliver. They're saying if we're going to spend 40% of our life in a company, it better mean something and better be worthwhile. Studies have now shown that if you have satisfied employees and you can migrate them from being satisfied to engaged, productivity improves 45% to 75%. And if you can have inspired employees from engaged, productivity improves 125%. Our holy grail is to try and get more and more of a talent population to be inspired. They're not going to be inspired unless they feel that spending 40% of their life in a company does mean something at the end of the day. So companies need a purpose. We need to answer the question to our talent population, what are we on fire about? Why do they need to come to work every day? What is a big intractable problem that we are trying to solve? And for us, it is about reimagining global agriculture. And that's what inspires our talent pool to come to work. So for us, if this is our purpose, then we have identified 8 material areas. These 8 material or focus areas reflect the 9 planetary boundaries. And in each of these material areas, we have various programs. We have 4.33 million farmers. We are the world's largest corporate farmer. We cultivate 21 different crops across 2.4 million hectares of land. So how do we maximize crop per drop of water? So we have bred onion varieties now through conventional breeding, not genetically modified, not GMO, that has increased solid content in our onions from something like 13% to 26.5%, which means we have saved 7,800 hectares of land that we need to cultivate those onions to feed our 5 factories. We have saved 65 million cubic meters of water, and we have saved the company $100 million in costs. That's one example. We have attached an IoT sensor on every tree trunk of our almond orchards. In Griffith, in Australia, small place, we have 3 million almond trees. Every 10 trees has this IoT sensor that detects the expansion and shrinkage of the tree trunk because of moisture stress. Not visible to the naked eye because it moves in microns. It then triggers a drip irrigation system to release the exact quantity of water required for the precise period of time, and that has improved our water usage efficiencies by 20 to 23%. How do we translate all this to our 4.3 million smallholder farmers? That is the key in terms of the 150 programs that we run across the 70 countries that we operate. And finally, we believe in order to change and make sustainability real, we have to change at 4 levels. We have to change at the individual level. So will I shave or brush my teeth with the tap running? Then I don't understand sustainability, right? Everything that we can do in our individual lives to conserve and do more with less is the first change we have to create. The second change that we have to create is companies and firms have to change. If we do not change as companies, we have no hope of changing the world. But even if individuals, as individuals we change and as companies we change, we have no chance. We have to change sectors. And therefore, we have to build collaborations across the agribusiness sector. So we created and catalyzed the creation of the Global Agribusiness Alliance, trying to bring all the agri companies together so that we can combine our insights, all the configuration of assets and capabilities that we have to make a real change. And even if these 3 levels of change happen, we can't change. The 4th has to happen, which is government policy. The Singapore government this year has introduced a carbon tax, which was announced last year, effective from this year. And they're saying that they did it. 3 years ago, I was encouraging them to, advocating for them to introduce a carbon tax. And they said, how can we disadvantage Singaporean companies when other countries are not introducing a carbon tax? So 3 years later, they've introduced. I asked them, what changed? So they said, one thing changed. We signed the Paris Accord. And we have clear targets that we have committed to reducing that. If carbon is free, we'll pollute indiscriminately. If water or electricity is free, we're going to use it indiscriminately. So if behavior is to change, we have to price carbon. I wish more countries will follow that. And that is the collaboration that we need to change the world and change our sector. Thank you.
Thank you. I've just been handed a magic ticket that says we actually have a few more minutes. So if anybody's dying to ask a question, put your hand up and I'll ask you. But I did want to come to our final panelist, who insisted that I ask him the last question because the World Bank is hosting this panel, and so as a gracious host, we thank you. Unless you're now going to hold us hostage and go on for 30 minutes because you're the last one. But let me ask you a little bit. I mean, you've heard all sorts of different views on implementation and partnerships. Tell us about your role in terms of financing these goals. And I was curious on the due diligence side. How do you measure success as you go down this path and not wait until the end to take stock? How are you coming about and looking at those way markers?
Right, thank you so much. The only advantage of speaking last is perhaps to claim that all of the insightful, good comments shared by the panelists were basically mine, and I was going to say them. So anything good that you have heard so far, and there are many, you can assume that the World Bank is behind them one way or another. But let's get into the basics, and I think in the issue of implementation, and I'm very pleased that this session is happening today rather than having it in the year 2027. I bet that there will be one a couple of years before the end of the 2030, as we had many before the end of the MDGs era. But at the time when we started to consider that, it was a bit late. And despite the call of the UN Secretary General then to have an acceleration agenda, it was really very difficult to save the day for those who didn't really do their homework early on in the first 1,000 days of the implementation of the MDGs. And this is one of the major lessons, that yes, the targets, the goals are big, overwhelming, aspirational, but the need to consider implementing them early and to have a good position as far as getting them localized is very much required in the early days of implementation. Then the second point that was raised several times when the SDGs were thought about is this issue of partnerships. And I'm happy to understand that we all in different ways are seeing that partnerships are important. It's a very good word to say partnerships, public-private partnerships, country partnership framework between the World Bank and its partners. But these partnerships are not risk-free. They come with their own trouble, with their own accidents, with their own risk, and we need to be very much prepared to deal with them. And we shouldn't really be shying away from fixing these risks, mitigating them, and continue on, because there is no other way to deliver the SDGs but through good, effective partnerships. But they require trust, and they require good contracts. And quoting a good article by The Economist, contracts would be the best and most meaningful invention since the creation of the world. But again, you need to have good parties to negotiate these contracts, especially if you are after long-term association with the private sector. I was once with the Minister of Transport of the UK like 12 years ago, and he said, well, these partnerships with the private sector are too complicated. I'm afraid, with all honesty, that I don't have the qualified advisors and consultants in my office, so I hire advisors and consultants to advise me on how to negotiate these PPPs. And we're talking about a very advanced, open economy with good caliber in government. So here, I think, while we are all engaged in that, and before getting into the private sector with its motives that are very much legitimate and objectives, but again, even when we talk about partnerships, I would assume with the presence of Mr. Steiner, UNDP could be the closest of the UN system to the World Bank in the way that they do most of the business. But I remember again, in the last 1,000 days of the MDGs, when we were trying to conduct joint study on 17 countries, that was not really an easy mandate to do, and how to use our own governance structure, our own procedures, in order to have this kind of a joint partnership. It required lots of good work, negotiations, until we managed to get these studies done. And we're not talking even about financial transactions. So again, on this issue of partnerships, we need to get them seriously. And then in the three areas of work that the World Bank is involved in. The first one is on data and evidence, and Claire mentioned many good things, and her role in the Partnership for Sustainable Development. Data is getting many of us together, including the private sector and and think tanks and the international organizations. But it really puzzles me in a way that Christine Lagarde, in an event, I think it was the celebration of the independence of the Bank of England, mentioned that we have today data. 95% of these data have been created during the last 2 years. So for someone who works on SDGs and development, one could be very happy to have this kind of generation of data. But again, as mentioned yesterday in the discussions on the SDGs, one of the most fundamental areas of work on the SDGs, poverty, we don't really have good comparable data that goes in an updated way, and we use 5 years old data. So this kind of a puzzle needs to be resolved, because we have the capacity, we have the intelligence to do it, we have the investments that could be directed to fund these basic tools, household surveys. And while we appreciate very much in the bank, and we are very happy to see many of my colleagues who are leading our work on science, technology, and innovation, and data solutions, including using big data. But in many cases, as confirmed in one of our development reports, while we are pushing for digital solutions, there are some basic analog solutions that shouldn't be compromised. And here, basic infrastructure, legal frameworks, protection of data, freedom of information, all of these will not really be solved by data. They need systems, they need legal framework, they need adherence of the society and the leadership in order to deal with them. Quoting one very famous movie from the Egyptian culture, when a mayor was very much interested to marry a married wife, he sought some sort of an advisor, and he had a very clever advisor, and he would assume from a mayor of a village in Egypt, but that man was clever and vicious at the same time. He told him, well, the books are ours, and the ledger is ours as well. الكتب كتبنا والدفاتر دفاترنا. This is in Arabic, meaning that we can really do whatever you like. It's basically, we control the data, we have the monopoly on the data, and then we can always assume that we had achievements in the SDGs. And sometimes I'm really very much surprised about some of the statements of progress, while the evidence is not really showing that. However, this kind of democratization of data is helpful, but again, on the infrastructure of data, we need to do more. On the finance, I'm happy to speak after Sani, and the role of the private sector, and actually see this kind of openness of the World Bank, the UN system, And we identified gaps that cannot really be resolved even if the ODA is going to be meeting the 0.7%, which we haven't never met, by the way. But even if we get the 0.7% of GNI, that will not really be helpful to fix the trillions of dollars required for funding. So back in the day in Addis, we talked about finance for development based on the billions to trillions, on leveraging the private sector, and in adhering to the basic rules that we shouldn't really go and crowd out the private sector and use concessional finance at the expense of public goods like education and health, and get ourselves busy building airports and seaports and the like, which could be done better by the private sector. And then with that, it's not just a funding issue. As we have seen it in comparison between some of the infrastructure that were developed by the state and others that were developed by the private sector in terms of durability, in terms of quality of service, they have been supported better by having the private sector involvement under effective regulation of the government. But again, these partnerships are not going to come risk-free, and there are going to be many question marks about matters unless you have good contractual arrangements and good competition. And that's why many of my colleagues today, as we speak, are talking about the new models under the notion of cascading finance and the maximization finance for development. And the very final thing, while the goals are global in nature, and we started to share the common sense approach that no one size fits all, but even if you want to talk about one country, like say Egypt, what could be required for Alexandria is very different from Aswan. And you need really to be patient, you need to have this kind of granularity of data, and you need really to have this kind of capacity to tailor solutions. And I was very pleased, and there is no wonder that she is the Minister of the Year, my good old friend, Minister Inderwati, that the issue that she mentioned now is not about budget, it's about how she is getting from the districts some ideas and to solve the problem at a district base. For a country as huge as this, basically would encourage countries with smaller size, with less challenges to do the same. So on the three fronts, we're ready to do more, on the data front, on the finance front, and if you're asking our teams, we're not just happy to do country partnership frameworks, but we are willing to do more at the subnational level, at the village level, but we need to open the books, not like our some of the bad mayors in some villages. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'm gonna eat up all of the clock and just put one last question to the panel, which where I sit is really the elephant in the room, because we've been talking a lot about partnerships and implementing SDGs. But you know, what happens when your partner walks away? And I was in Taormina at the G7, which ended up being a G6 + 1 because the US refused to reaffirm. Ashton, I'm going to come to you because you opened the can of worms on taxation policy. So, you know, what happens when the partner walks away and the visuals of that aren't very good, and when you're trying to get everybody to kind of buy into these goals, it opens the door for slippage?
I think you move forward because in democracies, governments change and they will change again. And I think right now you have two very clear pieces of evidence. The Paris Agreement is the most universal agreement behind the Montreal Protocol. The last two countries joined after the United States at the federal level indicated that it will withdraw. And many of the US states are actually progressing with the Paris Agreement. And remember, California is the 7th largest economy. So I think it's a real setback, but it actually doesn't destabilize the progress. The other remarkable thing is that Europe is now saying to the US, well, if you don't really want to implement the Paris Agreement, then there will be no TTIP trade agreement, because Paris is an integral part of trade agreements in the future. And this is something that Pascal Lamy and I already 7 years ago in a report tried to point out to the world, that if the world was not able to reach a global agreement on climate change, global markets would begin to disaggregate, and climate will be one of those, because you cannot have one part of the world investing in a low-carbon economy while the other one simply continues trading. So I would argue, yes, we have these changes in government and in policy, But at the end of the day, it took us, 25 years to arrive at a response to global climate change, which in the view of those who already were convinced by the science was an eternity. In human history, it's a nanosecond. And, it's the most ambitious project ever negotiated with 7 billion people. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And in that sense, I'm a complete optimist on the world, in a sense, transitioning through a phase in which one country in particular has chosen to signal its dissent.
Claire, I saw you nodding. Are you equally optimistic on?
Yes, I'm always optimistic. And I think also if there were no risk of partners ever walking away, the kind of partnerships that we were brokering probably wouldn't really be worth having in the first place. Because the point of spending the effort and the miles of travel and the time that we spend developing these partnerships is to create change, is to encourage organizations, be they governments, be they companies, to do things that they would not have done otherwise. And that is always a difficult and challenging process. You're asking people to push themselves beyond what they would normally do and perhaps what they feel completely comfortable doing. So if there were no risk of breakdown, then almost by definition, the partnership would not be worth having because you wouldn't be adding anything to what would have happened in the absence of that partnership. I mean, I very much agree with what Akim just said. I think where that happens, the important thing is not to lose heart, is to continue with those countries or companies who do want to continue to make that change. And of course, to also think about the internal politics of the company, the country, the others. What is it which is the barrier to a particular company, a particular country signing on to a partnership? And how can the prospective partners help that entity to overcome those barriers and ultimately to join that partnership? But I don't really see we have any choice other than to be optimistic.
Well, I'm well and truly over my time. Normally I summarize panels, but I don't think we have time. And I think, Claire, you might have just done that for us when you said if there's no risk of partners walking away, there's no point in having them in the first place. Thank you very much to the 7 panelists and to the audience this afternoon.